On October 19th, the core set Age of Overlord released in the TCG, bringing with it the new generic Link 2 monster SP Little Knight. This card can be summoned using any 2 effect monsters, but gains the additional effect to banish a card from either field or graveyard if a fusion, synchro, XC or link monster was used as a material. Additionally, it has a second effect, allows it to banish any 2 monsters from the field, using at least 1 from your own field, until the end phase of that turn, whenever your opponent activates any card or effect. During its first showing at YCS Indianapolis, SP showed immediate impact upon how the game was played. All 32 topping lists played at least 1 copy of it, with specific decks such as Rescue Ace even allocating additional extra deck slots to the card. Even decks that are normally locked out of summoning SP, such as Rika Sunavalon or Exorcister, consider the card valuable enough to play a singular copy of it. In the 2 next YCSs, YCS Richmond and YCS Bologna, decks such as Baronne and Savage managed to top despite not playing the card. Not because these decks didn't want to play SP, but because they physically could not find space for it in the extra decks. This factor, coupled with their standard plays naturally locking them out of the card, resulted in SP being absent from their lists. Although strong, the effects of SP Little Knight are not game warping. However, these effects put on a generic Link 2 that's incredibly easy to make as a result of the Charmer links, or any Link 1 such as Link Rebo turns SP into an incredibly versatile piece of removal. The power of the card lies not in its abilities, but the ease with which those abilities can be employed. As such, every deck that can summon SP has been playing it as part of the extra deck, purely because of how low investment it is. Another card released in Age of Overlord was Superstar Slayer Typhon Sky Crisis, a rank 12 XC monster that can be summoned on top of any monster like a Zodiac, as long as the opponent summoned more than once from the extra deck during either the current or previous turn. Its 2 effects of returning a monster to hand without targeting and of floodgating any monster with 3k or more attack are powerful, yet come at the cost of locking you out of summoning for the rest of the turn after summoning Typhon. Like SP, Typhon has found its way into tons of extra decks since its release, not due to its power, but once again because of its versatility and ease of access, at the cost of no longer being able to summon for the rest of the turn. Any board of 3k bodies is potentially threatened. Both of these cards have impacted how the game is played. Because they are generic and able to be played in any deck, they transcend format-specific interactions and impact how the game is played at large. In both deck building and gameplay, these cards alter the decisions the player make, similar to when Yugioh and Dark Ruler No More were released in 2019. Yet, there's a major difference between SP and Yugioh, namely, the former resides within the extra deck. This brings us to the main topic of this video, namely the game design of generic extra deck monsters. Many people have voiced complaints about this aspect of the game, including certain content creators on YouTube like Team APS's Paul. Their complaint is that decks end up being all the same, with similar endboards of Baronne, IP or Apollousa, which in turn reduces archetypes to being mere engines rather than unique strategies. Of course, there's merit to this complaint. Certain decks like Mannadium or Super Heavy Samurai manifest as engines without their own identity, competing for the niche of creating as many generic end bosses as possible. In addition to this, a card such as Baronne de Fleur, a completely generic level 10 synchro that provides an easy omni-negate plus a pop during your own turn, is of such a high power level that any deck capable of making a level 10 synchro will have to consider it. The same can be said about the 1/2 negates that Apollousa provides, or the IP into SP interruption. These cards are so powerful while also being totally generic, that they appear as obvious inclusions onto any endboard capable of creating them. At least, that's the proposition made by many detractors. Farva called them the horsemen of the generic endboard, referring to cards such as IP, Baronne, Apollousa, and Baronne and Savage Dragon. Any deck, as long as they can spam enough bodies and a tuner or two, is theoretically capable of ending on this exact group of boss monsters. Particularly emblematic of this are some of the recent synchro decks, such as Super Heavy Samurai and Vanadium, lacking their own archetypal boss monsters. These decks follow a game plan focused on summoning as many generic bosses as possible, with the only major points of diversion being how efficiently they can end on them, and some minor differences in their specific endboard. For example, Super Heavy Samurai has access to regulars, Vanadium can incorporate cross-ship into their combo. Players online appear to unanimously agree that decks such as these represent a game design flaw. However, the exact nature of the issue is an ongoing point of dispute. Notable content creators such as Farva, Joshua Smith, and Team APS all agree that the generic bosses themselves are the issue, and therefore merit being banned. Judging from the most recent ban list, which ended up banning Baronne and Savage Dragon, the people in charge of the TCG format are in agreement with them. Baronne, although a strong monster, is not particularly game-breaking. The TCG has also never banned an Omni-Negate boss monster in the past, whether archetypal or generic, instead opting to remove floodgates, consistency, or combo enablers. Many archetypes also possess their own Omni-Negate, with as most recent example the Voiceless Voice deck, indicating that negates are not too strong to exist in the game's current landscape. Instead, banning Baronne and Savage is a direct declaration that the game design of these cards, their status as generic bosses, is the problem. The question then becomes, are they? Like any aspect of game design, the validity of cards can only be correctly assessed and criticized in light of what function they fulfill. In this case, we first need to understand both what generic extra deck monsters add to and remove from a deck. Only then is it possible to answer whether extra deck homogeneity is an issue that requires solving. Generic extra deck monsters are not a modern invention of the game, but have been around ever since the introduction of synchro monsters. Just how generic exactly the monsters are has greatly increased since. From synchros who demand a combination of tuners with the correct sum of levels, to Xyz who only ask monsters to share a level, and then from Xyz to Lynx who can be summoned merely by sending any two bodies to the graveyard, as long as the summoning conditions are met. Synchro monsters like Gojo Guardian, Stardust Dragon, and Black Rose Dragon are infamous for being some of the most powerful early synchro monsters, finding their way into any competitive deck at the time that had the tuners and levels to make them. Later during the XC era, Rank 4 toolbox decks followed a similar philosophy, playing a variety of Rank 4 utility monsters, such as Lavalval Chain and King of the Feral Imps. Finally, following the release of the Nightmare cards during the early Thrains era, most decks played the Nightmares as generic removal options in addition to their extra linking capabilities. Cards like these are important for the game. Nightmare Phoenix gives decks the option of outing back row, no longer requiring the archetype to have its own outs, nor to simply rely on drawing the out. It saves card designers from feeling obligated to give every new archetype its own spell and trap removal or monster removal. The same principles can be applied to boss monsters. By allowing Varudras and Baronne to exist in the game, it saves Konami from the mandate of giving every deck their own archetypal negate to not lose to Evenly or Lightning Storm. Historically, Power Sword Dragon was a revolution for this reason, as it suddenly gave every deck an accessible OTK line. Access code later sped this up, yet still not every deck plays it, such as Full Power Tearlaments or Sprite, which both needed no help to OTK. This illuminates the invaluable benefit that the concept of generic extra deck monsters provides. It is impossible to expect an archetype to cover every option, to possess every type of interaction. Looking at the Tearlaman's extra deck as an example, a variety of generic monsters were either played or considered, because they fulfilled a niche which the archetype itself could not cover. Baguska was played as a counter to Dimension Shifter, to hopefully survive a turn. Apollousa was an important replacement for Vulcalos in the Fluwanderees matchup, against which the former is essentially a vanilla. Generic extra deck monsters help cover niches that an archetype itself is unable to fill. Particularly in the context of an endboard is this important. Think for example about the endboard of Beetroopers, which is simultaneously powerful and fragile. They can put up several pops and negates, yet almost all of these are aimed only at monsters. The deck has zero counterplay to an Evenly, to a Lightning Storm, or to a Tactics card. The deck would love to be able to play Baronne de Fleur, purely to fill this gaping weakness, its inability to effectively deal with non-monster cards. Similarly, this endboard is incredibly mediocre for particular engines, such as Fluwanderees or Enchained. Destroying 3 monsters is rather lackluster against a deck that summons more from deck after being destroyed. A balanced endboard contains as many types of interaction as possible without focusing too much on one type. Playing only negation or only a removal opens your deck up to critical flaws, whether it be evenly matched or Zeus. In an ideal world, every archetype can play all forms of interruption, but in reality this doesn't happen. Some decks lack negates, others lack removal, and some decks don't even have volatile boss monsters whatsoever. In these cases, generic extra deck monsters act as a band-aid for the cap and coverage. It allows Konami to focus on a particular gimmick of a new strategy without needing to add the standardized effects of negation, destruction, banishing, without having to sacrifice the playability and coverage of that new strategy. At the same time, there's a sacrifice involved in designing a new archetype like this. A board of generics is not identical to a board of archetypal cards. An endboard of Baronne, Apollousa, IP, and Savage may be repetitious, it may be boring, but it is not particularly strong, at least comparatively speaking. What I mean exactly with that, I will explain in the following section. In my previous video, I discussed the power of archetypal hand traps. One of my primary arguments in that video was that the design of cards such as Hafnis or Magnum Hood has more potency than standard generic hand traps like Ash Blossom, for the simple reason that they interact with your engine. Whereas Ash Blossom stops your opponent from making a play, Hafnis gives you plays, allowing you to potentially outpace your opponent. The same dynamic can be observed in archetypal boss monsters and generic boss monsters, although to a lesser degree. And once again, Tearlaman's itself proves to be a fantastic example to highlight this phenomenon. In its prime, Tearlaman's never played any of the generic bosses mentioned throughout this video, but not due to a lack of being unable to summon them. During its earlier Danger Tier incarnation, Apollousa was a popular link for the deck to build towards, and early on, during its Shishu Tier format, some players were experimenting with the Finer as a means of making Baronne. Totally Awesome through Bahamut Shark was an easily accessible negate as well, but in spite of all that, these cards proved to be unpopular in competitive Tearlaman's builds. Singular negates were rather ineffective in the mirror match, and the archetype's own plays were more than enough to beat other decks. As a result of this decision, the deck turned out to be exceptionally weak to some common spell and trap board breakers, particularly Triple Tactics Talents and Evenly Matched. Evenly Matched specifically proved to be a powerful card against Tear, threatening to wipe out the entire board without much possible recourse. Of course, Tearlaman's had counterplay by ending on Type 3 Redoer or Beatrice, which, by being chained to Evenly Matched, would allow the Tear player to partially rebuild their board again, following the Evenly Matched. Regardless, these plays only helped mitigate the damage. And still, regardless of that, the missing utility of being able to negate spells and traps was never a big enough problem to include Baronne or Toad over. Instead, the Tearlaman's endboard was almost completely devoted to using the effects of the actual Telements cards. Its ideal endboard contained Rulkalos, Suliak, Pearl paired with cards like Beatrice, Redoer or Sprite Elf. And despite these latter three not being Telements cards, their primary function was still to trigger Telements cards. Meanwhile, take a look at the endboards that Mannadian and Super Heavy Samurai make, flooded with generic extra deck monsters. These decks cannot strategize for the long game because their engines do not allow them to do so. More specifically, cards like Baronne, IP and Apollousa only serve the purpose of stopping your opponent from killing you that turn, or letting you live long enough to see your next turn. That is essentially the goal of the player going first. Prevent your opponent from killing you on turn 2, so you can kill them on turn 3. Of course, in X-Fold Yu-Gi-Oh! This is never as cut and dry as simply creating an endboard and having it get broken or not. Often, an endboard gets partially broken, or the turn player is able to fully break the board, yet unable to kill through it or set up enough interruptions to prevent their opponent from killing them on turn 3. In these cases, it is not possible to simply enter battle phase and immediately kill with your whole endboard. You need to make additional plays first in order to deal out the 8k damage, something that a board consisting only of generic boss monsters is incapable of doing. They need to already have follow-up in hand and grave in order to seal the deal. Similar to how Ash Blossom only has utility in stopping your opponent from playing during turn 0, so a card like Baronne only has utility as a means to stopping your opponent from killing you that turn. Compare this to Brandon's boss monster Mirror Jade, arguably one of the best fusion bosses in the game. Its supposed cost of sending an Alba's fusion from extra deck to graveyard gives you follow-up during the end phase and Fulcrum, Ad Libitum and Sanctifier. The Banis effect can be abused several times in one turn, leading to even more follow-up as well. In Castira, Arise Heart's Black Hole effect and its Macrocosmos effect mutually work together to trigger the Castira spell and traps. The recently reviewed Whitewood's archetype similarly has a level 8 synchro that it would rather summon over Baronne de Fleur, because it can not only recycle any of the Whitewood's back row from the graveyard, but also summon the other Whitewood's synchros, which in turn serve as their own interruptions, as well as making the graveyard effects of the Whitewood's tuners essentially free. These cards are all powerful boss monsters, yet get elevated to another level due to also synergizing with their own archetype. Bosses like Kaleido Heart and Mirror Jade not only represent interference during the opponent's turn, but also additional cards during your next turn. Of course, the above generic archetypal dualism is not rigidly demarcated. Many archetypal bosses exist that offer nothing to their own strategy, for example Cyber Dragon Infinity or Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, if not for belonging to an archetype and therefore having synergy with their archetypal support. These cards may as well have been generics. Their only function is to act as a wall against your opponent's offense, doing their best impression of Baronne de Fleur. At the same time, sometimes generic bosses have incidental synergy with a strategy that plays them. Think here about Totally Awesome returning a Telements Castilla from graveyard to hand after using its negate, or how the graveyard effect of Promethean Princess allows Garunix to summon itself from the graveyard as well, rebooting your entire Fire King engine. These cards, although quasi-generic in both summoning condition and effect, provide through their means of interruptions resources to the main archetype. They are walls, but by accident also become engines. In these cases, however, it's a product of the effects of a specific card synergizing with the unique playstyle or type or attribute or effects of an engine. Baronne de Fleur itself also serves as an example for this. Besides its two effects of negation and targeted destruction, it also has a third effect that allows it to, during the standby phase, return itself to the extra deck in order to summon a level 9 or lower monster from the graveyard. The purpose of this effect is to reset Baronne's once per copy negation effect by allowing it to be resummoned with a revived material. However, because of the generic nature of this effect, it also enabled the resurrection of floodgates and engine cards. If any aspect of Baronne made its design bannable. It was this effect. Not because it was the most powerful effect, but because it gave a generic extra deck boss monster the ability to return to playing with your core engine. Compared to the follow-up provided by Mirror Jade and Kaleido Heart, this effect of Baronne is rather mediocre. Yet, it is its presence on a generic boss monster that also negates, that broke it. All of these factors discussed above blend uniquely together within the Snake Eye deck. At its core, Snake Eye is characteristic of the standard one-card combo deck that aims to build a board of generic link and synchro bodies. Yet, the biggest strength of Snake Eye is not its board building capacity. In this regard, it is rather subpar. But instead, the overwhelming amount of follow-up it is able to create using Flambirds is what made it truly tier 0 deck. By sending Flambirds from the field to the graveyard using either IP or Promethean Princess, it revives 2 Snake Eye bodies, which in turn provide you with extra bodies or searches. Without this effect to revive your starters, even disregarding how it would affect the combos, Snake Eye would hardly pose as a significant threat. As a general conclusion, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, board breakers are more powerful than ever. No board is truly unbreakable. A strategy that puts all of its baskets in its endboard cannot realistically compete against an adaptable, grindy deck, at least not on a consistent basis. Generic end bosses do not need to be banned because of the crimes of decks like Vanadium or Super Heavy. These decks are already handicapping themselves by making such boards. By banning cards such as Baronne, this does not only invalidate decks without their archetypal win conditions. The more significant effect is that it removes utility from decks like Sword Soul or White Woods, decks perfectly content to rely on their own bosses yet include generic monsters to fill up niches the archetype natively lacks. It limits the archetype to their own interruptions exclusively. Removing player agency in what they prioritize during gameplay and deck building, removing versatility in being able to counter different strategies or adapting to a new metagame, and ushers in a hierarchy where the archetype itself is the sole determination for a deck's strength. I began this video by asking whether a card like Baronne or IP is an obvious inclusion. The answer to this is neither a resounding yes or no. Their inclusion completely depends on the specific deck, or rather, the omissions from that deck. In a deck with abundant spot removal, there is no reason to play IP if your deck already has its archetypal negates. Baronne similarly may appear unnecessary. Generic extra deck monsters, whether they be utility like Typhon or the Nightmares, or bosses like Baronne or IP, only exist to fill up holes in archetypes, to allow for more decks to become playable. They only appear to be dominant because no archetype can realistically cover every type of possibility.